Let's talk about the PR/public relations of South African politicians. So the average person will never have lunch with the president, much less shake hands with our mayors. So as a result, politicians create an image around them for people to feel connected and feel closer to them. So as a result, PR is very important, very critical. For example, with PR, I could literally say cupcake, and we both know who I'm talking about. That's effective PR and branding. Is cupcake really a cupcake? Who knows? But that is the power of branding and PR. Even now, there's a page on TikTok run by the head of communications for the Office of the Presidency. And this page has like nearly 1 million followers just dedicated to posting videos and images of Cupcake and showing these very vulnerable moments to sort of humanize him to the South African public. And on top of that, also showing critical moments where he's demonstrating moments of leadership and importance.
Is he prepared?
Well, South Africans are never humiliated, are they? South Africans always go into everything holding their heads high.
So that goes to show how important PR is. So before I get into an even further analysis of different politicians in South Africa, hit the subscribe button. Let me know what your thoughts are on whether or not on who you think has a really good PR campaign in South African politics. Who do you think is winning the PR battle? So the first person on our list is Helen Zille. And the next automatic question is, are we watching the reinvention of Helen Zille? So increasingly, we've seen Helen Zille in the media, for instance, from her Showmax comedy roast to even having a TikTok, doing TikTok challenges.
Hate us because they ain't us.
Exactly. They hate us because they ain't us.
Even describing herself as a go-go, but she's a cool go-go, not like your normal go-go. She's a cool go-go, you know? So even at those little aspects, trying to humanize who she is, especially when you consider how the DA and Helen Zille herself have been viewed as people detached from South African reality. So yeah, are we watching the reinvention of Helen Zille? So before we get into all of that, it's really important to take a bit of a step back and look at the entire broader picture. So Helen Zille was head of the DA from 2007 till 2014, and she had stepped aside as they wanted to invite fresh blood in the organization and new faces. And this is when Mmusi Maimane had stepped into the scene. But also bear in mind, right, there's a lot of other factors also going on in this entire period. For instance, the EFF had just launched, and they were really, really creating a lot of tensions in South Africa and also ruffling a lot of feathers in the entire South African political scene. On top of that, this is also around about when Rhodes Must Fall had also just begun, and also other subsequent movements like Fees Must Fall, but that was a bit later. On top of that, also, a lot of South Africans were looking around after the end of apartheid and also looking around and seeing, have any changes really been made here within South Africa? So as a result, also, the DA didn't really have a lot of good PR, also a lot of good relationships with a lot of South Africans. Even they also had their own, like a lot of PR scandals also in around about this time period. For instance, the DA and the DA-led Western Cape had built public toilets. They built these public toilets, and however, it was intentional, because how do you build a toilet without any walls? So they purposefully built a toilet without any walls around it, and it was sort of like really dehumanizing and really like humiliating. And on top of that, it really like created like a lot of tension amongst different people, a lot of South Africans, because sort of like, how are you also delivering services, but you're purposefully trying to go out of your way to humiliate people? So on top of that, also, Helen Zille had her own scandal where she had made tweets about how amazing colonization was, and a lot of countries wouldn't be where they are today without the help of colonization. Of course, that didn't go over well. And as a result, that's also what led to her entire suspension from the DA. So you sort of had this entire situation where the DA, and by extension Helen Zille, haven't been portrayed in the best lighting also. And it's sort of been a continuation. For example, even after her suspension, like changing her hairstyle from that traditional Karen hairstyle to getting like a nice little bob, making her a cool go-go, you know? So for example, even those little aspects, even launching a podcast called Tea with Helen, all these means of trying to soften her, even posting her going to dance classes with her husband. Like, yes, in her spare time, she happens to be saving South Africa, but also she's a normal lady who's also above the age of 50, who just happens to do normal everyday things. This is just who she is. But of course, right, it sort of like resulted in her sort of being pushed to the side within the DA. Of course, she has major influence and a lot of major power. And as of late, right, we have increasingly seen Helen Zille in the media. And that sort of makes me question a lot of things, right? The reinvention of Helen Zille is nothing new, right? We've seen this repeatedly throughout history. But this moment, just this moment, feels very different. And automatically, the question that comes to mind is, are we watching a campaign by Helen Zille for leadership within the DA? So, Helen Zille does have significant leadership. She runs the policy branch. However, right now, we've increasingly seen in the media from comedy roasts, on top of that, from also running campaigns on social media, being very front-facing, right? But it sort of seems that right now, this is the first time that other political parties in South Africa have real opportunity to be able to grasp onto power, especially with the entire GNU situation. And as a result, this is also the first time that Helen Zille maybe might be feeling that she's really close to power. I remember it was like around about last year, there were a lot of articles and also a lot of rumblings within the DA mentioning how John Steenhuisen wasn't favored, wasn't liked within the DA, for instance, and that also he wasn't really the most popular candidate and the most popular choice. And of course, that was leaking out into the public sphere, leaking out into the rest of society. And it sort of makes you question, right? These people writing these articles, this is a purposeful means of being able to sort of like warm the public up to potential shift in power within the DA. Who knows? But on top of that, it's been really interesting, especially now as Helen Zille is beginning to rebrand herself. She's been doing these things like, for example, being more relatable, but it's a bit of a contradiction, especially when you consider how she's making these statements about employment equity. Also, for example, just this week, she made statements about also praising how Afrikaners have been able to lift themselves up by the bootstraps in this country. Obviously didn't go over well. But touching on the first point, right, Helen Zille had mentioned employment equity, right, and going on about how everyone should have equal chances. But then in the same breath, you think about John Steenhuisen, who's the head of the DA, as in charge of one of South Africa's most critical departments, which is the Department of Agriculture. He's somebody who, before this point, right, had not registered for any formal higher education. He doesn't have a degree or anything like that. He only has a matric. Look, I'm not saying that pursuing higher education is a bad thing at any point in life. That's not what I'm saying. But what I will say is that you have somebody who is at the peak of like their political career in such a significant position, such as agriculture, that guides a lot of South Africa's economy. And this person doesn't really have anything beyond matric. Perhaps maybe just the school of life, you know? So I'm not saying the school of life hasn't taught him anything, but you just having somebody else within your organization, such as Helen Zille, who is mentioning employment equity, and in the same breath you have John Steenhuisen, who doesn't even have anything beyond a matric. What employment equity does John Steenhuisen have? Maybe he has a connect within government. And it's also a bit of a spit in the face when you also consider how within South Africa, like 12% of people who have graduate degrees are unemployed. On top of that, also, you have there's a high, massive unemployment rate within South Africa, and also a lot of issues discussing, in terms of employment equity, and in terms of how a lot of opportunities in South Africa are distributed within a 1% minor class within South Africa. So with this being said, you have Helen Zille trying to refurbish, soften her public image, but in the same breath, hey, the head of your organization doesn't even have more than a matric. And look, I'm not saying that pursuing education at any age is a bad thing, but I wouldn't want the person who's the head of the organization and head of one of our critical departments in government to not have anything more than a matric. Maybe at least a bachelor's degree or something. So yeah, with that being said, also, it's important to also consider, especially when you consider how that there's a bit of this divide within the DA and also within Helen Zille, how she's putting herself forward even before somebody like John Steenhuisen sort of points to divisions. And also, there's somebody else within the DA who also didn't have a matric certificate. This was, I think she was the chief of staff to the mayor here in Pretoria. She also didn't have anything beyond that. And it sort of makes you question, you're pushing these ideas, pushing these stances and these positions, but yet critical people within your organization don't really have those things. And it's sort of is it rules for thee and not for me? Who knows? I'm not gonna lie, very honestly speaking, I kind of find Helen Zille very entertaining to watch. I'm always so curious, how are you gonna pull this off? How are you gonna make this work? Because generally in terms of media and also broader society and also how people interact with the DA and her by extension, it's sort of a bit unlikable. Even in terms of like, for example, just changing her hairstyle from going from a Karen to being a relatable like auntie, for instance. These deliberate actions try and soften her in the minds of South Africans. So I'm just always curious, like, how are you going to pull this off? But she's very entertaining to watch, very fun to watch, and I just can't wait to see like where this is all leading up to. Like, what's the grand plan after this? So PR is not cheap. It is very detail oriented. Even for example, with Helen Zille getting onto Showmax and doing that entire comedy roast. On top of that, also running these social media campaigns, also having these events where she's able to make statements, also these curated events where she looks more human. That takes a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of resources. Even recently, I remember reading an interview with Helen Zille's stylist and how she's helped rehabilitate her wardrobe, you know. So you can see this is a very careful, curated thing that goes on. And on top of that, I remember there was a scandal with Durko. With Durko, what happened earlier this year was that the spouses of ministers went for an etiquette training. And like the reason why is because like they're representing South Africa when they're with their spouses who happen to be ministers, and they also need to be able to carry themselves in a very specific manner. So PR is quintessential, PR is critical. So as a result, right, you have a lot of effort and resources that go into this, and it's really necessary to be able to help people also know how to interact with you, and it also helps also projecting an image, which brings us to our next person on the list. Different background, right? I know. My audio file got a little messed up, but let's continue. The next person on the list is former President Jacob Zuma. I know, very divisive, very controversial. I am personally not a fan, but let's have an honest conversation. Former President Jacob Zuma has one of the best PR teams out there. The devil works hard, but his PR agent works harder. He has a type of PR agent that can get you out of hell and into heaven. That is how amazing his PR is. For example, right, he's been able to escape his entire personal image intact from the arms deal, for example, even further, like the sexual abuse allegations. On top of that, the entire situation around Gupta Gate, state capture, and Nkandla fire pool.
Announce Nkandla. They've now learned Nkandla.
Even further, like even going to prison for contempt of court, even coming out of that and having the entire 2021 riots that were in his name. You just see all these scandals, but somehow he's able to remain unscathed. Even recently, he's now head of the MK party. And with that being said, also, he's been able to mobilize that party and being able to remove the EFF from third position in terms of political parties in South Africa. And on top of that, being able to capture key members of the EFF. That is some type of influence and also good imaging and branding. On top of that, I noticed this thing about him is that when you see these allegations, it is very difficult for people to sort of see these allegations, but also have this image in your mind of who he is. Because when he presents himself, also when you see him, he's singing, he's happy, he's very jovial, very approachable, right? He's just like your sweet president, former president, right?
That's my father gave me.
What does it mean? It means the one who jokes and laughs. Is that right?
Jokes and laughs, not at all. In one sense, it means one who laughs with you was endangering you. Okay. Literally. The one who laughs with you was endangering you.
Should I be scared now?
No, do not be scared at all. I would never endanger you. That's just a name.
Does it fit you?
But when you compare him to all these allegations and all these investigations and all these things I've mounted against him, it's very difficult for people to grasp their minds around that. And somebody's always able to emerge as this
What's happening?
person who is fighting for the liberation of all black people and all key people within South Africa. But when you also compare that presentation with the actions, does it match? I pose that question to you. Does it match? You'll let me know. With that being said also, right, you see these contrasting images, even in terms of being able for him to be able to rely on them in key situations, such as, for example, like singing songs like Umshiniwa, even for instance, like in terms of how, with the entire situation around Gupta Gate, how he collaborated with British firm Bell Pottinger to be able to mobilize this image of white monopoly capital. Even further than that, even now joining the MK party, when you see all the allegations that have been mounting against him, and all the things that he's been involved within, it's very, you sort of see him as this person who's been repeatedly fighting this system. And even now, in his old age, even now, he's still fighting for this, against this system, and fighting for the liberation of all people. So it's very difficult to sort of like have this thing in your mind, these allegations, but also see the side of him, also how he is jovial, and sort of creates a big contrast between these two different people. But I think that he's really set the blueprint in terms of South African politics, because even now we have our current president, Cupcake, and how he's really heavily leaned into this image of being this relatable person, you know what I mean? And however you receive that, whatever like that, he's been able to mobilize that, always able to sort of soften his image, making him this relatable person. You don't sort of see the person that's like a billionaire who's like the leader of Africa's, like the leader of Africa's superpower, for example. Those things sort of fall away when you see Cupcake. And that is effective PR and branding that he's been able to achieve. And it sort of makes you question now, with the current talks of how, and current articles also, of how Patrice Motsepe is going to be stepping into the head of the ANC, and sort of like how is he also going to brand himself and sort of make him acceptable to the rest of South African broader public. Who knows? But sort of like when you see how the blueprint has been laid out by former President Jacob Zuma, and how sort of current President Cyril Ramaphosa has also been continuing that same blueprint, is it sort of like how many people are able to relate to these people. And honestly, I would say like Helen Zille should hire Jacob Zuma's person, because his guy is able to achieve and able to maneuver every single scandal. And maybe she could use him maybe to help her in her imaging, who knows. But with that all being said, right, with all these aspects and these different actors in this game that is politics in South Africa, what do you think? Who do you think is winning the current battle for PR? And who do you think is able to mobilize this and able to get themselves into a significant position later on? I think of a couple of people, but let me know if you want me to make a part 2 of this video. There are a couple of people I think of right now that I'm like, oh, you have a very interesting PR system. But yeah, like, comment, and also let me know what your thoughts are about this entire topic. Yeah, see you next time. Bye.